Sit down. I do not say this kindly. I rarely say anything kindly. But sit down. Close your eyes. If you wish, you will not need them for what follows, and listen. Because I am going to tell you about a creature so far beneath the notice of ordinary wizarding society that most of you have never once paused to consider what he actually was. Not what he did, what he was. A house self. A word your kind tosses about with the same idle contempt you reserve for a smudge on your spectacles or a stain on your robes. Something to be tolerated, something to be used, and yet 2 words, 2 syllables, really, when you strip away the pause between them. That is all he said. That is all he had left to say. Blood pooling beneath him on a strip of grey sand, while the sea exhaled and withdrew, exhaled and withdrew, indifferent to the small, twisted body dying in front of a boy who had, by that point in his short and catastrophic life, watched a great many people die, and had not yet learned, not in the marrow, what it cost. I am going to tell you why those 2 words did more to win a war than any spell Harry Potter ever cast. I am going to tell you who Dobby was before he was a footnote in someone else's heroics. And I am going to tell you, in rather more detail than you are accustomed to hearing, precisely how the death of a house elf reached into the chest of the boy who lived and rearranged what was beating there. Settle in this will take some time. I am not in the habit of rushing what deserves to be understood properly. Let us begin, as one must with any creature of consequence, at the beginning with what a house elf is, because you cannot appreciate what was lost on that beach until you understand the peculiar, suffocating nature of the existence Dobby was born into. House elves are bound, not by chains, not by curses cast at one point, but by something far older and far more insidious. Magic itself, woven into the very fabric of elfkind, tying each of them to a family, a house, a bloodline, from the moment of their birth until the moment of their death. This is not servitude in the sense you might understand. Servitude, a job one might leave, a contract one might refuse to sign. It is ontological. It is written into what they are. A house elf without a master is, in the eyes of the wizarding world, barely a house elf at all. He is an aberration, a thing unmoored, wandering, pitied by some and feared by others. Because a house elf who does not serve is a house elf whose entire architecture of being has been shattered and left to reassemble itself into something the world has no ready category for. Consider what this means for the psychology of such a creature. Consider it properly, not with a lazy, sentimental half-thought most wizards spare for the subject before returning to their tea. A house elf's magic is bound to obedience. His sense of worth, his sense of purpose, is not merely tied to service, it is constituted by it. To be told he has done well is, for a house elf, something close to what praise from a parent might mean to a small child starved of affection. To be punished, and here I mean punished by his own hand, forced by the peculiar self-referential cruelty of elvish magic to injure himself for perceived disobedience, is not merely painful. It is a kind of internalized violence, so complete that the elf becomes both the tyrant and the victim in the very same gesture. He does not need a master standing over him with a whip. He has been made to carry the whip inside himself. Peyton now plays a small, spindly creature with bat-like ears and eyes, the size of tennis balls, enormous, green, luminous things, like a pair of lanterns set into a face otherwise built entirely of sharp angles and thin, papery skin into the household of Lucius Malfoy. I knew Lucius. I knew him for decades, in circles both public and considerably less public, and I can tell you with the authority of long and unpleasant acquaintance that there are few men better suited to teach a bound creature the precise dimensions of his own worthlessness. The Malfoy household was not merely a house that owned a house self. It was a machine for the production of subservience, oiled by generations of pure blood certainty that some beings are simply lesser, that the natural order of the world places some creatures beneath the boot and others above it, and that any softness shown to the former is not kindness, but weakness, a crack in the foundation through which the whole edifice of superiority might come flooding in. Dobby grew up, if grew up is even the correct phrase for a creature whose entire life before Harry Potter seems to have been an unbroken stretch of diminishment inside that machine. He was made to iron his own hands when he transgressed. He was made to slam his head into cabinets, into walls, into whatever surface presented itself, because this was the only vocabulary of correction his magic and his masters had left him. War. And I want you to sit with this image, because it is not incidental. It is not a comic touch added for the amusement of children. He wore a single, filthy pillowcase. That was his uniform. That was the entirety of the wardrobe afforded to a sentient, magical being who had served a family for the whole of his existence. I want you to picture it properly, not as a cartoonish sketch glimpsed in the corner of a page, but as a real thing, standing in a corridor of a real house, lit by real firelight, a small hunched figure with skin the color and texture of an old, worn glove, dressed in a single grey rag with a hole cut for his head, flinching before anyone has even raised a hand, because flinching has become the permanent architecture of his posture. That is who walked into Harry Potter's life in the summer before his second year at Hogwarts, uninvited, terrified, and utterly, desperately determined to save a boy he had never met. Ask yourself why. This is the detail that so many casual observers of this story skate past without pausing. And it is, I would argue, the single most important fact about Dobby's entire character. He came to warn Harry Potter at enormous personal risk, for a boy who owed him nothing, out of nothing but conviction, not obligation, not a spell compelling him. Conviction. He had heard whispers servants hear everything, you understand, because servants are furniture to those they serve, and furniture does not need to be spoken around carefully of a plot forming at Hogwarts, a plot that endangered Harry Potter's life, and rather than remain silent, rather than do what every fiber of his conditioning screamed at him to do, which was to stay small, stay quiet, stay invisible and obedient, he defied his masters and traveled, uninvited and alone, into the home of the boy who had, quite without meaning to, quite without even knowing he had done it, become something like a symbol of liberation to an elf, enslaved by the very family responsible for the horrors that boy had survived. Do you understand the magnitude of that? Harry Potter, at 15 months old, ended Voldemort's first reign of terror. He did not do it through any conscious act of heroism. He did it by surviving, by being loved, by having a mother who placed her body between a curse and her child, and in doing so unraveled an entire ideology's certainty of its own supremacy. Dobby, a hound whose master's arm bore the same brand as the monster who murdered Harry's parents, had spent years watching his own family degrade and diminish other creatures on the strength of precisely the beliefs Harry Potter's very existence had punctured. To Dobby, Harry Potter was not merely a famous boy. He was proof. Proof that the hierarchy Dobby had been born into, trained into, beaten into accepting as immutable was not, in fact, immutable at all. So he came. He stood in Harry's bedroom, wringing his ears, weeping onto Harry's bedspread, trying to warn a boy who did not want to be warned, who wanted only to survive the summer with the Dursleys and return to the one place that had ever felt like home. And when Harry, understandably frustrated, refused to promise he would not return to Hogwarts, Dobby did something that I confess, even I, a man not given to soft assessments of house elves or of much else, find remarkable. He took matters into his own hands. He intercepted a letter meant to reassure Harry that his friends had not abandoned him, allowing Harry to believe himself forgotten, isolated, unloved, purely because Dobby had calculated, in his frantic, devoted, catastrophically unsubtle way, that misery at Privet Drive was safer than danger at Hogwarts. And then, when persuasion failed entirely, he dropped a pudding. I want to linger on this moment, because it is so often played for laughter, and it is absurd a house elf, sobbing with the effort of his own daring, levitating a bowl of treacle pudding above a room full of the Dursleys' dinner guests, and letting it fall but strip away the comedy and look at what is actually occurring. This is a being who has spent his entire existence being punished for disobedience, choosing, quite deliberately, to manufacture a catastrophe severe enough that Harry would be locked away, punished, kept from Hogwarts by the very people meant to protect him. Dobby was willing to make Harry hate him. He was willing to be seen as the villain of the piece, to be the reason for Harry's misery, if it meant Harry survived whatever danger awaited him in that castle. That is not comic relief. That is a creature so devoted to another's safety that he was prepared to sacrifice the one thing he seemed, on the strength of that first meeting, to want more than anything else in the world: Harry Potter's good opinion of him. He failed, of course. Harry went to Hogwarts regardless, flew there, in point of fact, in a manner so reckless and so thoroughly against every rule of magical secrecy that I still, to this day, marvel that Albus Dumbledore did not simply expel the both of them and be done with it. And the horror Dobby had tried so desperately to prevent unfolded regardless. The Chamber of Secrets opened. The basilisk stalked the corridors, and it was revealed, in time, that the architect of that horror was none other than Lucius Malfoy himself, who had smuggled a cursed diary, a fragment of the Dark Lord's own soul. Though none of us understood that particular horror at the time, into the school, through the innocent, unsuspecting hands of his own daughter. Dobby, it transpired, had known, not the full shape of it, perhaps, but enough to come with a warning. enough to risk everything he had, which, in fairness, was very little, but a being who has nothing still has something to lose when he has spent his whole existence being taught that even nothing can be taken further from him. And so we arrive at the liberation, a scene so satisfying, so perfectly constructed as an act of narrative justice, that I confess even my well-cultivated cynicism cannot entirely resist its pleasures. Harry, having pieced together that Lucius Malfoy was responsible for planting the diary, and having deduced correctly, as it happened, that Dobby's frantic warnings had been born of genuine loyalty rather than malice, contrived to free Dobby from his servitude. And he did it with characteristic Potter cunning, though I use the word cunning here with rather more generosity than I typically extend to a boy who spent most of his adolescence blundering into danger through sheer bloody-minded luck. Harry knew, because house elf lore is, in fact, quite precise on this point. Whatever your Muggle education may have led you to assume about magical creatures being governed by vague and arbitrary whimsy, that a house elf can only be freed if his master presents him with clothes. So Harry hid a sock inside the diary itself. That cursed and blackened object he handed back to Lucius Malfoy with a sneer worthy, dare I say it, of myself. And Lucius, in a fit of contemptuous rage, hurled the diary at Dobby, ordering him to be rid of it, and in doing so, unknowingly, unwittingly, handed his servant an item of clothing. The sock slipped free. Dobby caught it, and in that instant, an existence that had been bound since birth to a family that despised him was, in the span of a single falling garment, undone. I want you to imagine what that felt like. Truly imagine it, not merely observe it as a plot device rewarding a protagonist's cleverness, but sit inside the sensation of a creature whose entire sense of self had been constructed around servitude, suddenly, catastrophically, gloriously free. Lucius Malfoy, incandescent with fury, lunged for his wand, meaning, one presumes, given the man's character, to do the freed elf some considerable harm, and Dobby, small and trembling and utterly transformed, pointed a single quivering finger at his former master and warned him, in a voice that had found, for perhaps the first time in his life, something like authority, that he must not harm Harry Potter. Lucius was blasted backwards down a flight of stairs by a magic that answered, for the first time, not to servitude but to devotion freely given. That is the moment Dobby became something the wizarding world had almost no framework for. A free house elf, acting entirely of his own will, in defense of a boy he had chosen, mind you, not been assigned to protect. You would think, perhaps, that freedom brought Dobby ease. It did not. This is where the story becomes, in my estimation, considerably sadder than most retellings allow it to be, because freedom for a house elf is not the unambiguous triumph it would be for a human. Dobby spent the better part of 2 years attempting to find employment and being turned away repeatedly by wizarding families who regarded a free elf one who expected, God forbid, to be paid, to have holidays, to be treated with something resembling dignity as an affront rather than an opportunity. He was, in his own words, considered too eccentric by his own kind for wanting wages. He wandered, he searched, he was rejected, and all the while he carried, unwaveringly, an adoration for Harry Potter so total that he began, without invitation, without contract, without so much as being asked to leave gifts, hand-knitted, garishly mismatched socks, deposited outside Gryffindor Tower. A small and slightly ridiculous tribute from a creature who had almost nothing to give and gave it anyway. He eventually found his way, as many displaced and desperate beings eventually do, to Hogwarts itself, to the kitchens beneath the Great Hall, where he took up unpaid work among the other house elves. Though Dumbledore, ever the quiet architect of decency in that castle, insisted on paying him a wage and granting him holidays, an arrangement Dobby accepted with the sort of anxious, polite gratitude of a being who has never once been offered fairness and does not entirely know what to do with it when it finally arrives. It was, in that capacity, an elf toiling contentedly, almost invisibly, in the vast subterranean kitchens of the school, that Dobby crossed paths with Harry Potter once more, during the Triwizard Tournament, when Harry found himself in dire need of a way to breathe underwater for an hour in the depths of the Hogwarts lake. And it was Dobby, not the celebrated professors, not the accumulated wisdom of the school's finest minds, but a small elf in a kitchen, remembering an old story about gillyweed, once told to him by another elf named Winky, who supplied Harry with precisely the solution he required, refusing all thanks, insisting only that it was his honor to help Harry Potter, always, in whatever small way he could. Do you see the pattern forming here? I want you to notice it, because it matters enormously for what comes later. Every single instance of Dobby's involvement in Harry's life follows an identical shape. Harry is in danger. Harry does not ask for help, and Dobby provides it anyway, expecting nothing, requiring no acknowledgement, motivated by nothing but a devotion so pure it borders on the sacrificial. This is not incidental characterization. This is foreshadowing, written in the quiet, unglamorous language of small kindnesses, repeated so many times that by the moment Dobby's story reaches its conclusion, we should not be surprised in the slightest by the scale of what he is willing to give. We have simply forgotten to notice how consistently he has already been giving it. Now, let us travel forward to the war, to the real war, the one without pretense, without the comforting fiction of a Triwizard Tournament's manufactured perils, the one in which the Dark Lord had returned in full, and the Ministry itself had fallen, and Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger were fugitives in their own country, hunted across a landscape that had once been merely magical and was now, in addition, deeply and specifically dangerous to them. They had been captured through carelessness, through the uttering of a name that ought never to have been spoken aloud, a taboo placed upon Voldemort's own name that summoned snatchers wherever it was uttered and dragged, bruised and half-recognizable behind a swelling hex, to Malfoy Manor. I need not describe that house to you in loving detail. I spent enough evenings within its walls during those years to have no romantic illusions about its elegance, concealing anything but rot. It was there, in the drawing room where I myself once stood, reporting to a creature with no nose and no mercy, that the trio's fate very nearly ended where Bellatrix Lestrange, a woman whose devotion to the Dark Lord was matched only by her appetite for cruelty, tortured Hermione Granger on that same drawing-room floor, carving a word into the girl's arm with a blade that I trust you understand I do not describe further out of any excess of delicacy, but because some horrors do not require embellishment to land with their full weight. And it was into that house, into that precise moment of maximum peril, that Dobby arrived. He had not been summoned. No one had thought to call for him. He came because Aberforth Dumbledore's mirror shard messaging system had reached Harry, because a chain of desperate improvisation had somehow, miraculously, connected a boy trapped in a cellar to a house elf working in the kitchens of Hogwarts, and Dobby recognizing an old, familiar sensation, the sensation of Harry Potter in danger, and no one else positioned to help him, did what he had always done. He came. He appeared in the cellar where Harry, Ron, and the goblin Griphook were imprisoned, and with the particular, understated, magical strength that house elves possess, a strength, I should note, that far exceeds what their diminutive stature would suggest. A strength born of that same deep, ancient magic that binds and, when freed, empowers them. He engineered an escape so audacious that I confess, reviewing the sequence of events even now, I find myself unable to suppress a certain grudging admiration. He disarmed Bellatrix's own house elf, ensured a chandelier crashed down at precisely the moment of maximum chaos, and, in the culminating act of his rescue, apparated the entire party: Harry, Ron, Hermione, Griphook, Dean Thomas, Luna Lovegood, and Ollivander, the Wandmaker, a group far larger and more burdensome than any single elf ought reasonably to have been able to transport away from that house of horrors, and down onto a stretch of grey, wind-scoured beach, beneath Shell Cottage, the home of Bill and Fleur Weasley. It should have been triumphant, should have been, in the grand tradition of narratives that reward loyalty and courage, an unambiguous victory the moment the small, overlooked creature saves the great and celebrated hero, and everyone breathes a collective sigh of relief. Instead, Bellatrix, in a final, spiteful act of violence hurled at a fleeing target, flung a silver knife across the drawing-room in the instant before the apparition took hold, a knife that found, with the particular cruelty of coincidence, its mark. I will tell you now what happened on that beach, because I think you deserve the full weight of it, not a softened version filtered for comfort. Harry knelt over Dobby's body in the dark, the elf's chest, that thin, fragile chest, beneath the single filthy garment he had worn his entire life. The pillowcase and drags aesthetic he had never once thought to change, even in freedom, because freedom for Dobby had never meant luxury. Only dignity was marked by a wound Harry could see even in the dimness. The knife had struck true. There was no healing this. There was no potion in Harry's satchel, no spell in his repertoire, no desperate incantation that would undo what a jealous, hateful woman's blade had already done in the half-second between escape and safety. And Dobby, dying, actually, genuinely dying, not merely wounded in the theatrical, temporary sense, that fiction so often permits its beloved characters, looked up at Harry Potter with those enormous green eyes. Eyes that had, over the years, held terror and gratitude and mischief and devotion in equal measure. And he was not afraid. He said, and I ask you to hear this properly, not as a line recited, but as the final utterance of a being who had spent his whole existence being told he did not matter, he said, softly, that Dobby was happy, happy to be with his friend, happy to be with Harry Potter, friend. Consider the audacity of that word, spoken by a house elf about the most famous wizard of his generation. Consider what it undoes. Every hierarchy Dobby had been born beneath, every assumption of his own inferiority that had been beaten and ironed and slammed into cabinet doors until it calcified into the architecture of his existence, undone in his final breath by the simple, radical claim of friendship, offered not as a plea, not as a servant's presumption, but as a fact he had apparently held quietly and certainly in his heart the entire time. He did not, even in death, revert to the vocabulary of servitude that had shaped every other relationship of his life. He named Harry his friend, and then, as the strength required for further words left him, as the light behind those great green eyes began its final dimming, he managed only the two words with which we began. Not a plea for help, not an apology, not even, strictly speaking, a complete sentence. Simply the name spoken the way one might speak a name to fix it, one final time, in the center of one's attention, before the world goes dark. A name that had once represented, to a small enslaved elf, trembling in a corridor of Malfoy Manor, the very possibility of liberation. A name he had chosen to serve out of love rather than obligation. The only kind of service, I would argue, that carries any moral weight whatsoever. And now the last thing his failing consciousness fixed upon, the last shape his devotion took, was that same name, spoken not to the boy who had freed him, but to the friend who had never quite understood, until that exact moment on that wind-swept beach, just how much he had been loved. And then he was gone, just like that. No final flourish, no last surge of magic, no narratively convenient reprieve. A house elf, barely 3 feet tall, who had defied his masters, freed himself from bondage, saved Harry Potter's life on multiple occasions across 5 years, and orchestrated, at the cost of his own existence, the rescue of 7 people from the drawing room of the most dangerous family in Wizarding Britain, dead, on a beach in the dark, having asked for nothing in return except the privilege of being useful to someone he had chosen to love. Now, I promised you I would explain why this mattered, why 2 syllables from a dying elf reshaped the trajectory of an entire war. Let us examine that carefully, because it is here that the true significance of Dobby's death reveals itself. And it has very little to do with elves at all, and everything to do with the particular, dangerous delusion that had been quietly forming in Harry Potter's mind for some months prior. You must understand what Harry had been carrying with him through that autumn and winter of hiding, hunting Horcruxes across a hostile and increasingly desperate landscape. And Harry, exhausted, grieving, frightened, and quite understandably desperate for some avenue of hope more concrete than the grim, plodding business of destroying fragments of a madman's soul had begun to fixate on them, not as scholarly curiosities, not as an interesting footnote in wizarding folklore, as a goal, as, perhaps, the answer, a shortcut through the war, a way to become powerful enough, invincible enough, that the losses might finally stop. I want you to recognize what that fixation actually was beneath its glamorous trappings. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a hero's fantasy of power as salvation. It was the seductive, all-too-human belief that if one simply became strong enough, gathered enough magical might, assembled the right combination of legendary artifacts, one might transcend the ordinary vulnerabilities that make loss possible in the first place. It is, I would suggest, a fantasy that has claimed better and worse men than Harry Potter throughout history, myself among them. In certain darker chapters, I do not intend to revisit this evening the fantasy that mastery over death, mastery over one's own vulnerability, is the true solution to grief and fear alike. And then Dobby died in his arms. Not Voldemort, not some grand supernatural confrontation worthy of Hallows and prophecy. A house elf, killed by an ordinary knife, thrown by an ordinary act of spite on an ordinary beach in the ordinary dark. There was nothing legendary about it. There was no grandeur to salvage from it. It was simply loss, small, personal, devastating, entirely unglamorous loss of a being who had loved Harry with a devotion so complete it had cost him his life. And in that moment, I would argue, the entire architecture of Harry's fixation on the Hallows began, quietly and irreversibly, to crumble. Because here was the truth the Hallows could never actually address. No wand, however elder, however unbeatable, would have stopped that knife. No cloak, however invisible, would have shielded Dobby from Bellatrix's spite in the half-second it required to cross a drawing-room. No stone, however capable of summoning the shades of the dead, could give Harry back the particular irreplaceable warmth of a living creature who had chosen, freely and repeatedly, to love him. Power does not prevent loss. Power does not, in fact, do very much at all against the specific, granular, individual tragedies that make up a war. It is grand. It is impressive. It photographs well in the mythology of legends. And it is almost entirely useless against a single knife, thrown by a single embittered woman at a single, small, devoted friend. I want to draw your attention now to what Harry did next, because I consider it, of everything in this entire sequence, the single most morally significant choice he makes in the whole of the novel, more significant, in its way, than his eventual confrontation with Voldemort, because it is a choice made entirely without an audience, entirely without strategic necessity, entirely for its own sake. He decided to dig the grave by hand. Bill Weasley offered to do it by magic. A swift flick of the wand, a hole conjured in seconds, efficient and painless, and, in the context of a war in which every moment of exposure risked discovery by snatchers or worse, considerably more sensible. And Harry refused. He wanted, he said, to do it properly, without magic. Sit with that refusal for a moment. because it is easy to read past it as simple sentiment. And I do not believe it is merely sentiment. I believe it is the precise moment at which Harry Potter, consciously or not, rejects the entire premise that had been quietly seducing him. The premise that magic, that power, that the extraordinary tools available to a wizard are the appropriate response to loss and grief and the fundamental unfairness of a small elf dying for a boy he barely knew. Dobby had lived his entire life being denied ordinary dignity. He had been dressed in rags while his masters wore silk. He had been treated as beneath the consideration of magic folk who would not hesitate to conjure a grave for him with a flick of the wrist and think no more of the matter. And Harry, understanding this, perhaps not in words, perhaps not in any way he could have articulated if you had asked him directly, but understanding it nonetheless in the place where genuine moral instinct lives, chose to give Dobby, in death, the one thing that had been withheld from him throughout the whole of his life, the ordinary, unmagical, physically effortful labor of being cared for by someone who considered him worth the effort. He dug for an hour, Harry did, blistering his hands on the handle of a spade, sweating in the cold sea air, refusing every offer of assistance beyond what Ron and later the others provided as they, too, began to understand what Harry was doing and why. This was not efficiency. This was not strategy. It was, in the most literal sense available to the English language, labor of love, the deliberate choice to expend physical effort, to accept discomfort and blisters and the slow ache of unaccustomed exertion as an offering to a creature who had never once, in the whole of his existence, been offered anything so costly by someone who had other, easier options available. And when the grave was dug, Harry wrapped Dobby in his own jacket, no fine funerary shroud, no wizarding rites conducted by qualified officials, simply the coat off his own back, and laid him in the earth, and stood over him and grieved properly, the way one grieves an equal, not the way one mourns the loss of a useful tool or a convenient servant. I do not believe I need to labor the symbolism further. You have understood it already, I trust. But I will say this plainly, because I think plain statement serves the point better than further ornamentation in refusing magic and choosing manual labor. Harry Potter honored Dobby, not as a house elf, not as a servant, not even merely as a hero who had saved his life, but as a free and equal being whose death deserved the same weight of unhurried, physical, human grief that any other friend's death would have demanded. He gave Dobby, in the moment of his burial, the dignity that an entire society built on the presumed inferiority of house elves had denied him throughout every day of his living existence. And here is where the true significance of this small, unglamorous funeral on a windswept beach reaches into the larger shape of the entire war, because Harry did not simply grieve. He decided something, standing over that grave. And the decision he made altered the entire remaining trajectory of his struggle against Voldemort. He abandoned the Hallows. I want to be precise about this, because it would be easy to overstate the neatness of the transition Harry did not, in some single triumphant epiphany, Renounce all interest in the deathly Hallows the instant the last shovelful of sand covered Dobby's body. Grief is rarely so tidy, and neither, in fairness, is the process of moral clarification that grief sometimes produces. But it is in the aftermath of Dobby's death, in the quiet, exhausted days that follow at Shell Cottage, that Harry begins, in earnest, to reorient himself away from the seductive fantasy of Hallows and mastery over death, and back toward the grim, unglamorous, and infinitely more difficult task he had actually been charged with: finding and destroying the Horcruxes, the fragmented pieces of Voldemort's own soul, anchoring him wrongfully to the world of the living. Consider the contrast these two pursuits represent, because I think it is the true thematic heart of everything we have discussed this evening. The Hallows represent accumulation, the gathering of power, of legendary objects, of mastery in service of transcending death, of becoming so strong that loss itself might be evaded or reversed. The Horcruxes represent destruction, not of enemies in some grand cathartic sense, but of the very mechanism by which Voldemort had attempted to cheat death himself, by fragmenting his own soul into hidden vessels out of a terror of mortality so profound it had led him to commit murder after murder in service of his own continuance. Do you see the mirror being held up here? Voldemort's entire war, his entire monstrous project, was born of the same fantasy that had briefly seduced Harry, the fantasy that death could be defeated, outmaneuvered, mastered, if only one accumulated enough power. Voldemort had chosen mutilation of his own soul as his method. Harry, in his exhaustion and grief, had briefly considered the Hallows as his own gentler, more heroic-seeming version of the identical fantasy. And it took the ordinary, unmagical death of a house elf, a being with no political power, no legendary status, no claim whatsoever to significance in the grand mythological structure of prophecy and destiny, to show Harry what Voldemort, in the whole of his long and murderous existence, had never once understood: that death cannot be defeated by power, only accepted, honored, and, where necessary, walked toward willingly, for the sake of those one loves. This is not incidental to what follows. This is the entire philosophical foundation of Harry's eventual walk into the Forbidden Forest. Wandless, no, not wandless, but purposeless in the sense of seeking no victory, no power, no mastery, offering himself to Voldemort's killing curse, not to defeat death through some grand magical trick, but to accept it willingly, so that those he loved might live. That walk, that final sacrifice, is unthinkable without the beach, without the grave dug by hand, without 2 whispered words spoken by a dying elf who had never once, in his whole difficult life, understood himself to be anything but fortunate simply to have been loved in return. Let me draw your attention to a pattern now, because I do not believe Dobby's death exists in isolation within this story. I believe it belongs to a lineage of sacrificial deaths that structure the entire saga, and understanding where it sits within that lineage illuminates precisely why it lands with the particular weight it carries. Consider Lily Potter, who died protecting her infant son with nothing but the raw, unmagical fact of her love. a protection so ancient and so poorly understood by Voldemort himself that he dismissed it as sentiment, even as it unraveled his first attempt at immortality. Consider Sirius Black falling through the veil in the Department of Mysteries. A death so abrupt, so unceremonious, that Harry barely had time to process it as it happened. No final words, no closure, simply the awful, ordinary suddenness of a man there and then, in an instant, not there. Consider Albus Dumbledore dying atop the astronomy tower in a manner so carefully orchestrated, so freighted with strategic calculation and controlled sacrifice, that his death reads almost as the opposite pole from Dobby's, a death of immense deliberation, planned to the smallest detail, executed for reasons of grand strategy that took the whole of the following novel to unpack. Dobby's death occupies a different register entirely from all three. It is not protective in the sudden, instinctive manner of Lily's sacrifice. It is not abrupt and meaningless in the manner of Sirius's fall. It is not calculated and strategic in the manner of Dumbledore's carefully staged demise. It is, instead, the culmination of years of small, unglamorous, unrewarded devotion, a death that makes sense only if you have been paying attention to every sock left outside Gryffindor Tower, every unasked-for act of assistance in a school kitchen, every terrified warning delivered at enormous personal risk by a creature who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. It is, in short, the death of loyalty itself, loyalty stripped of grandeur, loyalty that never once asked to be noticed, finally, catastrophically, noticed in the worst possible way, through loss. And I would argue that this is precisely why it functions as it does within Harry's psychology. Lily's death, Sirius's death, even Dumbledore's death, these are, in various ways, deaths that happen to Harry. Tragedies that befall him, losses that shape his fears and his fury, but that he experiences largely as a recipient, a survivor standing at the edge of catastrophe. Dobby's death is different, because Harry watches it happen in his arms, feels the last warmth leave a small, devoted body he could have, should have. Some deep and unreasonable part of him will always insist, protected better, moved faster, for anticipated more carefully. It is the first death in the entire series that forces Harry into direct physical proximity with the cost of being who he is, of being the person that dangerous and desperate creatures will risk everything to protect. Every other death has, in some sense, happened at a remove behind a veil, atop a tower, in a nursery Harry cannot even remember. This one happens in his own arms, on his own knees, in the dark, with sand beneath them both. That proximity is precisely why it dismantles the hero complex so effectively. A hero standing at a comfortable remove from consequence can afford to fantasize about grand power, about legendary objects, about the clean mathematics of triumph. A boy holding a dying friend cannot afford any such fantasy any longer. The abstraction collapses. What remains is only the plain, unbearable fact of loss, and the plain, clarifying question of what. Given that loss cannot be prevented by power, one intends to do with the time and love one still has left to give. I want to spend a moment before we draw toward our conclusion, considering what Dobby's death reveals about Harry's so-called hero complex more directly, because I have used that phrase somewhat loosely thus far, and I think it deserves precise definition. Harry Potter, across the whole of his adolescence, exhibited what I would diagnose, and you may trust my judgment on matters of psychological affliction in young men, having spent the better part of 2 decades observing this particular boy's tendencies at close and often exasperating range as a persistent and occasionally reckless compulsion toward self-sacrifice as spectacle. He rushed into the Chamber of Secrets. He entered the Triwizard Maze, knowing full well its dangers. He led Dumbledore's army in defiance of every reasonable warning. He raced to the Ministry of Magic on the strength of a vision he ought to have questioned more carefully, a rashness that cost Sirius Black his life. There is, in nearly every one of these episodes, a common thread. Harry acting alone. Harry positioning himself as the necessary agent of rescue or resistance. Harry operating under the largely unexamined assumption that the burden of confronting evil rests specifically and primarily upon his own shoulders. That his particular courage, his particular willingness to run toward danger, is what separates triumph from catastrophe. This is not, I want to be clear, a character flaw invented from nothing. It is entirely comprehensible, given the shape of Harry's life, a boy marked from infancy as significant, told repeatedly by prophecy and circumstance alike that he bears a unique responsibility, denied any ordinary childhood in which he might have learned that heroism is not, in fact, a solitary performance, but a collective and often unglamorous labor shared among many hands. But comprehensible is not the same as healthy, and by the time we reach the events of Deathly Hallows, this compulsion had metastasized into something considerably more dangerous. The fixation on the Hallows themselves, which I described earlier as a fantasy of power as salvation, but which I would now describe more precisely as the final, most seductive expression of the hero complex. The idea that if Harry could simply become powerful enough, legendary enough, master enough of death itself, he might finally, single-handedly, resolve the entire war through the sheer accumulated weight of his own significance. Dobby's death punctures this fantasy with a single, devastating question that Harry does not ask consciously, but that the narrative asks on his behalf. What good is mastery over death to a boy who could not save the life of the one small, devoted creature bleeding out in his arms? There is no answer to that question that flatters the hero complex. There is no version of Elder Wand supremacy, no configuration of Hallows, gathered and mastered, that would have moved fast enough, protected thoroughly enough, to stop a knife already in flight before Harry even knew Dobby had arrived to save him. The entire architecture of I alone can fix this. If only I become strong enough collapses in the face of a death that occurred not because Harry was insufficiently powerful, but because war is chaotic, cruelty is opportunistic, and love, however fierce, cannot always outrun a blade already thrown. What replaces the hero complex in the aftermath of that beach is something considerably more modest and, I would argue, considerably more powerful. The understanding that the war would not be won by Harry becoming exceptional, becoming a master of death, becoming legendary. It would be won, if it was won at all, through the same quiet, collective, unglamorous devotion that Dobby himself had embodied his entire life. A devotion distributed among many hands, many small sacrifices, many unasked-for acts of loyalty, none of which required mastery over anything so grand as death itself, all of which required only the willingness to give what one had, freely, to those one loved. Let us speak, finally, of what this transformation actually purchased for Harry in the concluding chapters of the novel. Because I do not want you to leave this evening believing that Dobby's death produced merely an abstract philosophical shift, some tidy thematic resolution confined to symbolism and metaphor. It produced, quite concretely, the specific emotional resolve Harry required to complete the 2 tasks that remained before him, destroying the remaining Horcruxes, and, in the end, walking into the Forbidden Forest to offer himself to Voldemort's curse. Consider the raid on Gringotts, executed with a recklessness and a desperate ingenuity that I would argue only makes sense coming from a boy who has stopped calculating his own survival as the primary variable in his decision-making. Consider the destruction of the Horcruxes that follows the diadem in the Room of Requirement. Consumed in funfire, summoned by Crabbe with a carelessness that nearly claimed Harry's own life alongside it. The fragment of soul residing, unknown to nearly everyone, within Harry himself. A fact he learns from my own memories, delivered to him through the peculiar intimacy of a pensieve. In the final act of information I was able to offer before my own death completed the accounting of losses this war demanded. And here I will permit myself, however briefly, a moment of professional relevance to this narrative, because my own death factors into this same sequence of events, occurring as it does in the same climactic stretch of the novel, and because it, too, in its own way, echoes the lesson that Dobby's death first offered. I died believing myself, for reasons both personal and professionally undisclosed for the better part of 2 decades, in service of protecting that boy, a devotion he did not know of, could not have known of, until my own final moments handed it to him in the form of memory rather than words. It is not, I think, entirely coincidental that Harry's walk into the forest follows so closely upon the revelation of my own long, quiet, and largely unthanked loyalty, layered as it is atop the earlier revelation of Dobby's. By the time Harry enters that clearing, he carries with him not merely the abstract knowledge that he must die, but the accumulated, concrete weight of every unglamorous, unrewarded act of devotion offered to him across the whole of his life, a house elf's rescue, a godfather's reckless love, a headmaster's careful strategy, a professor's decades of silent, resentful, but entirely genuine protection. He walks into that forest not as a hero seeking glory, not as a boy fixated on mastering death through legendary artifacts, but as someone who has finally understood because Dobby taught him first, on a beach, with a spade and a jacket and 2 dying words, that the only response adequate to the love he has been given is the willingness to give everything in return, without spectacle, without calculation, simply because it is owed. That is not nothing. That is, I would argue, the entire moral architecture upon which the final defeat of Voldemort depends. Voldemort could not comprehend a boy willing to die without seeking to master death in the process. He had spent his whole existence in terror of exactly the vulnerability Harry walked toward willingly. And that incomprehension, that fundamental inability to understand sacrifice as anything other than weakness, is precisely what left him unable to anticipate or counter what Harry's choice ultimately achieved. Before I bring this to its close, I want to carry the thread a little further forward, because a death of this magnitude does not simply resolve itself within the space of a single chapter and then politely disappear from the narrative. It leaves residue, it leaves architecture, and if you know where to look, you can trace Dobby's small, unglamorous influence through nearly everything that follows in the remainder of that novel, through choices Harry makes that have nothing ostensibly to do with a house elf at all, and yet would be, I think, entirely unrecognizable without him. Consider the matter of the wand. Harry, in the climactic confrontation in the Great Hall, does something that would have been unthinkable to the boy fixated on the Hallows only weeks earlier. Having won the allegiance of the Elder Wand, the single most powerful magical object in existence, the very artifact he had once fantasized, might grant him mastery over death itself. He chooses, quite deliberately, not to keep it. He resolves, once the battle is finished, to return it to my own tomb, to let the wand's story end where its previous masters ended, rather than wield it as a trophy of his victory, or a guarantee against future harm. I ask you to consider how radical that choice actually is. A boy who had once stood in a graveyard of memory and imagination, dazzled by tales of the Peverell brothers and the promise of invincibility, ultimately held the most coveted magical object in the wizarding world in his own hand, and chose to relinquish it. That is not the decision of a boy still seduced by mastery over death. That is the decision of a boy who learned on a beach, digging a grave with blistered hands, that the accumulation of power was never actually the answer to anything that mattered. Consider, too, the manner in which Harry conducts himself in the final confrontation with Voldemort, not as a boy seeking to overpower his enemy through superior magical might, but as one attempting, with a patience that would have been unthinkable in the reckless, hero-complex-driven youth of earlier books, to explain to Voldemort the nature of his own error. He does not simply duel, he reasons with the man, walks him through the tangled history of wand allegiance and Horcrux fragmentation, offers him, in his final moments, something almost resembling compassion, an opportunity, however slim, however certainly doomed to be refused, to feel remorse. That patience, that willingness to seek resolution through understanding rather than raw confrontation, is not the instinct of a boy still operating from the hero complex that once sent him charging alone into every danger that presented itself. It is the instinct of someone who has learned, through loss, that victory achieved through domination alone repeats the very error that created the war in the first place. And consider, finally, the epilogue that quiet, deliberately unglamorous coda set 19 years after the war's conclusion, in which Harry Potter is revealed not as a legendary master of death-wielding unmatched power, not as a figure of continued heroic spectacle, but as an ordinary father standing on an ordinary train platform, sending his own children off to school, carrying no wand of particular renown, seeking no further mastery over anything at all. That is, I would suggest, the truest possible testament to what Dobby's death purchased. Not a hero enshrined in perpetual glory, but a man who learned to want an ordinary life, precisely because he had come to understand. On a cold beach, with a small elf dying in his arms, that ordinary life, the kind Dobby himself had never been permitted to have, the kind of freely chosen, quietly loved, unremarkable existence that no amount of legendary power could ever manufacture, was the only prize worth having in the first place. There is a further layer here, I think worth naming plainly, because it extends beyond Harry himself and touches the whole of wizarding society. Dobby's death and the manner of his burial plant a seed that grows quietly through the remaining chapters and beyond them, a marker stone, engraved simply with his name and the words, "Here lies Dobby, a free elf," is the first instance in the entirety of this saga of a house elf being memorialized with the same dignity typically reserved for witches and wizards. It is a small thing. It occupies, perhaps, a single sentence in the text. But small things, as I trust you have gathered by now, are precisely where this story's deepest truths tend to reside. A society that had spent centuries treating house elves as furniture was made, however briefly, however incompletely, to reckon with the fact that one of their number had shown more courage, more loyalty, and more capacity for selfless love than nearly any wizard in the entire tale. That reckoning did not overturn wizarding society's treatment of house elves overnight. I would not insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise, nor would I pretend the book itself claims so tidy a resolution. But a grave marked with dignity is not nothing. It is a beginning, and beginnings in stories such as this one are very often planted by deaths such as this one. I will close, as I imagine you expected I might, by returning to the beach, because I think it is worth sitting once more, in these final moments, with the smallness of what occurred there, the smallness that is, paradoxically, the entire source of its power. Pear himself, barely 3 feet tall, dressed in rags, wearing mismatched socks he had never been permitted to choose for himself until freedom finally allowed it, died on a strip of cold sand beneath a sky indifferent to his passing, having spent every ounce of magic he possessed rescuing 7 people who would otherwise have perished at the hands of a war he had no political stake in whatsoever beyond the simple, radical fact of loving one of them. He asked for nothing in return. He received, in his final moments, the one thing his entire life had denied him: recognition from the boy he loved that he had been a friend, not a servant. And in dying, he taught that same boy more effectively than any headmaster's careful strategy, more effectively than any prophecy's grim mathematics, that the war they were fighting would not be won through the accumulation of power, through mastery over death, through legendary objects gathered like trophies against the darkness. It would be won, if it was won at all, the way Dobby had always fought it quietly, without expectation of reward, through devotion given freely to those one has chosen to love, and through the willingness, when the moment finally arrived, to give everything that devotion required, without calculation, without spectacle, and without regret. 2 words, a name, spoken one final time by a creature who had spent his whole existence being told his own name barely mattered, fixed at last upon the one thing that had made his freedom and his friendship and his death mean something after all. Sleep well. You have, I think, earned it.